activists were reporting that there were like people who were not Sudanese, who were dressed in uniform, driving these Central Reserve armored vehicles, and participating in the suppression of today's protests, which is wild. There were people speculating that they were Egyptian soldiers, entities, whatever. Some of them were saying they were Russian, but basically there are non-Sudanese people participating in the crackdown on protesters in Khartoum, which is wild.
Sudan's government has denied reports about the presence of Russian paramilitary group Wagner in Sudan. In a statement on Tuesday, the Foreign Ministry termed accusations by the ambassadors of the US, Britain and Norway on Wagner's activities in the Horn of Africa nation as a blatant interference in Sudan's domestic affairs. On Monday, the Troika for Sudan, the US, Britain and Norway said Wagner Group was engaged in illicit activities that undermine the rule of law in the country. The Sudanese Foreign Ministry, in its statement, said the Troika diplomats deliberately and in an arbitrary manner involved Sudan in the conflict in Ukraine. The ministry described the statement as an apparent violation of the established diplomatic norms and practices.
Everyone knows about the US and Blackwater, right? But have you heard of the Wagner Group? Well, if you haven't, then you might want to listen up, because it's arguably the world's most effective mercenary army, created, funded and controlled by Russia. It acts as President Vladimir Putin's invisible hand in Syria, Libya, Sudan, Ukraine, Venezuela, the CAR and even Madagascar. The group has created troll armies, tampered with Western democracies and electoral processes, fought and won real wars, taken over strategic territories, carried out assassinations, and the cherry on top of the cake, Russia's political interests are fulfilled while maintaining plausible deniability.
If we move back to today's protest in Khartoum, we know, as always, that Khartoum is hit the hardest by security forces because that's the center of government and they're afraid for themselves, and therefore they're going to be most mobilized, most concentrated, and most ruthless there. So the forces in Khartoum again attacked peaceful protesters in Bahri, in Omdurman, in central Khartoum. There were several reports, there's lots of photo and video evidence of the Central Reserve Forces in particular, who are police, by the way, who have been pointed the finger by the U.S. government and specifically sanctioned by the U.S. government for their brutality in the way that they handle these peaceful protests. They were out today literally ganging up on individual protesters and brutally beating them. And there's plenty of video of that. Activists also reported, in a really weird twist, foreign forces. It's not, I can't say foreign forces because it wasn't like large groups, but activists were reporting that there were like people who were not Sudanese, who were dressed in uniform, driving these Central Reserve armored vehicles, and participating in the suppression of today's protests, which is wild. There were people speculating that they were Egyptian soldiers, entities, whatever. Some of them were saying they were Russian, but basically there are non-Sudanese people participating in the crackdown on protesters in Khartoum, which is wild. It's wild. I want to read you one last thread. Of course, there were also mass detentions. There's one other thing I wanted to mention that they said was happening in Khartoum today. It escapes my mind. But I want to read you this thread by Hamid Khalafullah that summarizes what protesting was like today in Khartoum. So he says, "We're back to Bashir times. Today's protest felt like early 2019 protests. The crackdown was 100% Bashir's regime style. 1, plateless pickup trucks full of masked plainclothed officers, i.e. the intelligence service. 2, tons of forces at every corner, riot police, Central Reserve Forces, and the army. 3, mass detentions. 4, forces crazily screaming and hitting on their pickup trucks, meanwhile roaming in neighborhoods to terrorize citizens. And finally, violence continued for hours after the protesters were dispersed. But hey, Burhan said he'll relinquish power, and we should believe him." Upside down smiley face. That last part was for the international community. The resistance continues.